Imagine, for a moment, a door you are told never to touch. In a grand colonial home on the edge of Providence in 1762, such a door stood at the base of the Rutherfords' staircase. It was sealed with iron latches, blackened with soot, and marked by deep scratches that did not resemble the hand of man. The Rutherfords insisted it led only to the coal cellar, but servants whispered otherwise. They said that behind it, voices murmured late at night. Thin, uneven voices, like children calling from underwater. The town accepted these rumors in silence. The Rutherfords were powerful merchants, deeply woven into the fabric of colonial commerce. To question them was to invite ruin, but something about that door infected the imagination of every visitor. There was always a faint draft of cold air seeping through its edges, and with it, a smell, sour, metallic, like old blood and damp stone. Few dared linger near it. The servants crossed themselves, guests averted their eyes, but neighbors remembered something else, the family's twins. A boy and girl, born pale and silent, rarely seen beyond infancy. No one could recall them walking the streets. No one remembered them in the sunlit gardens. No one recalled their laughter in the yard. Only cries, muffled, weak, and quickly smothered, seemed to filter upward from beneath the floorboards. And then, one day, those sounds stopped altogether. Providence carried on. The church bells rang, ships came and went, fortunes were built. Yet beneath that elegant house was a silence that spread like a stain across the generations, a silence that began with the Rutherfords' basement, and with the twins who never saw the light again. The Rutherfords were no ordinary family. Descended from English traders who arrived in Rhode Island during the earliest days of settlement, they built their fortune in maritime commerce, rum, timber, and quietly the bodies of men chained in the holds of their ships. They sat in the front pew of church, dressed their children in imported lace, and offered generous donations to the parish fund. They were the image of stability, of Providence made flesh, but appearances deceived. The Rutherfords' mansion was a fortress against scrutiny, its windows curtained, its doors heavy with locks. The patriarch, Elias Rutherford, was said to be a man of unmovable will. Town records describe him as severe, given to long silences. His wife, Margaret, rarely appeared in public after the twins' birth, her once radiant beauty fading into a shadow of perpetual mourning. The household staff, indentured Irish girls, enslaved Africans, and a single tutor, learned quickly that silence was expected. Rumors of cruelty passed in whispers, meals withheld, punishments meted out in the dark, prayers forced long past exhaustion, and always the sound, the low moaning from beneath the floor. Neighbors asked questions cautiously, always met with polite dismissal. The twins are delicate, Margaret would say. The son does not agree with them. Or Elias would tighten his jaw and change the subject entirely. In the face of their wealth, their connections, and their iron control of reputation, no one pressed further. It was not unusual in those days for sickly children to be hidden away, but there was something different about the Rutherford twins, something that the family sought not to shield, but to conceal. And those who had glimpsed their faces, those few never spoke of it without shuddering. Only a handful of Providence citizens ever claimed to have seen the twins alive. Their names flicker through the records, half erased by time but never entirely forgotten. In 1763, the church midwife, Sarah Cobb, swore that the children's eyes were unnatural, black as the river at midnight. In her testimony, preserved in her private diary, she wrote, "They looked at me and I felt not the gaze of infants, but of something older, patient, and waiting." A year later, a visiting sailor reported seeing two pale shapes pressed against the upper window of the Rutherford home. He described their movements as jerking, as though learning to mimic the motions of men. And then, in 1765, a servant girl named Bridget vanished after confiding in a friend that she had heard laughter from the basement. High-pitched, distorted, echoing in ways no human voice should. Within a week, her absence was attributed to flight, and no investigation followed. By the summer of 1766, the twins were no longer mentioned in polite company. The Rutherfords hosted dinners, attended services, continued their maritime ventures. Their family portrait, painted that autumn, shows Elias and Margaret posed in stately fashion, their eldest son and daughter beside them. but where the twins should have stood, there is only empty space. The artist's notes preserved in a letter explained the omission. The family forbade me to paint them. They insisted the likeness could not be permitted to exist. From that year onward, the house seemed to breathe differently. The shutters rarely opened. The smell of damp earth clung more heavily to the cellar door, and the cries, once nightly, then weekly, faded into silence. Providence in the 1760s was a city in transition. Ships came laden with molasses, hides, and slaves. Taverns echoed with talk of revolution, though few yet dared to act. Families like the Rutherfords wielded unspoken power, shielding secrets beneath layers of piety and respectability. But beneath the surface, whispers spread. Some claimed the twins had died of fever, buried quickly to prevent contagion. Others muttered that they had been sent to an asylum in Boston, or even shipped overseas to be raised in anonymity. Yet among servants and laborers, a darker tale grew, that the children had never left the house at all, that Elias Rutherford had locked them away for reasons unspeakable, reasons rooted not in illness, but in something far older. The church, faced with mounting suspicion, offered no answer. Pastor Whitcomb, himself reliant on Rutherford donations, assured the congregation that the Lord works in mysteries. But in his private correspondence, preserved in fragments, he confided his dread. I hear them when I visit. God help me, I hear them still, a knocking, a crying, but not of babes. No, of creatures straining against flesh itself. To the townsfolk it was easier to forget. Easier to let silence smother unease than to confront the truth of what might be happening beneath the polished floors of a wealthy family's home. And so Providence turned its face away, letting the Rutherfords' name remain untarnished, their wealth untaxed, their house unbroken by law or pity. But silence is not erasure. What is buried in darkness festers, and the basement of the Rutherford house, with its sealed iron door, was not merely a place of concealment. It was a womb of corruption, slowly feeding on the family above. The architecture of the Rutherford home has long puzzled historians. Records show the house was erected in 1741, a sprawling colonial mansion of brick and timber, with a foundation that sank unnaturally deep into the hillside. Its cellar was twice the size necessary for storage, with corridors that led to chambers inexplicably sealed from the start. Masons who worked on the project spoke of Elias Rutherford's peculiar instructions. He demanded the basement be constructed in secrecy, forbidding laborers to discuss its details upon pain of debt or exile. One mason, years later, confessed in writing that he had carved symbols into the stone at Rutherford's request. Strange, curling patterns he did not understand, as though the walls were meant not to contain but to invite. The iron door itself was custom, forged in Newport, reinforced with bands more suited to a prison than a family estate. Witnesses remembered its delivery, shrouded in tarps, installed by candlelight. When asked about its purpose, Elias replied simply, "Providence has need of protections it does not yet comprehend." Over the years, water seeped through the foundations, staining the walls with mineral blooms that looked like reaching hands. Servants claimed that the air was colder there, unnaturally so, even in the height of summer, and always the smell persisted, acrid, metallic, and cloyingly sweet. To this day, architectural surveys of the site find inconsistencies. Corridors that should connect but do not, measurements that shift from one room to another, spaces where sound carries in impossible ways. The basement was not designed as storage. It was designed as a chamber of containment, a place to hold something, someone, that the family and perhaps Providence itself could not face in daylight. After the twins' birth, Margaret Rutherford became a figure of fading light. Once admired for her beauty and charitable presence, she withdrew into silence. Neighbors recalled her slow walks through the garden at dusk, her eyes fixed on the windows of the cellar as though listening for something no one else could hear. Her letters, what few remain, hint at torment. In one, addressed to her sister in Boston, she writes, "They do not sleep. They do not hunger as others do. Their cries are not for milk, but for something I cannot name. Elias says it is our duty to keep them hidden, that Providence itself depends upon it. But I dream of graves unmarked, of earth that will not close, and I fear the Lord has turned his face from me." Servants whispered that Margaret sometimes carried trays down into the basement at night, returning pale and trembling, her apron stained with substances not quite food, not quite blood. She ceased attending church, claiming sickness, though her illness seemed more of spirit than flesh. By 1768, she was seen only rarely, her hair gone white, her frame gaunt. Some claimed she spoke to the air in hushed tones, as if conversing with invisible children. Others swore she laughed in fits, a sound brittle and broken. When she died in the winter of 1769, the official cause was listed as melancholy and wasting. Yet those who prepared her body noted her arms bore long scratches, as though she had fought against grasping hands. Elias forbade an autopsy. Her funeral was lavish, but behind closed doors the household grew darker, heavier, as though Margaret's death had loosened what little restraint remained upon the horrors below. Elias Rutherford emerged from his wife's death not with grief, but with resolve. He became a man possessed, sleepless, feverish, muttering in Latin during business dealings, scribbling strange diagrams in the margins of shipping logs. His contemporaries describe him as a man at war with shadows. Visitors noted the library filled with forbidden texts, grimoires from Europe, treatises on alchemy, and even colonial pamphlets warning against witchcraft. A sailor later testified that Elias paid high sums for books seized from Salem during the witch trials, manuals once condemned to fire. Why? Theories abound. Some say he sought a cure for the twins, a way to transform them from the unnatural into the human. Others claim he sought to bind them, to prevent whatever force had taken root within them from spreading beyond the cellar. And a darker interpretation whispers that Elias was not resisting their influence at all, but serving it. By 1770, his ships bore strange cargoes, crates marked only with sigils instead of words. Dockworkers claimed to hear scratching and faint cries from inside, and more than once, such cargo was unloaded directly into the Rutherford cellar, bypassing markets and customs alike. Elias began hosting private gatherings at night, inviting only select men of Providence's elite. What transpired within those locked rooms is unknown, but attendees emerged pale, shaken, and unwilling to speak. The town knew better than to pry. The man who once ruled his household with rigid order now descended into something closer to priest, hood officiating rituals no one dared name, bound to the voices beneath his house. The Rutherford estate was staffed by many, yet their ranks thinned mysteriously. Between 1767 and 1773, at least 7 servants vanished without record. Bridget, the Irish girl, was the first. Then Isaac, a boy of 12, last seen carrying coal toward the cellar. Then Mercy, a cook whose brother begged for answers only to be turned away at the door. Each disappearance was dismissed by Elias. They have run off seeking easier wages, but townsfolk noticed a pattern. Each missing servant had complained of noises, of shadows moving in places where no one stood. One diary entry from a neighbor records, "A boy in livery knocked at my door, saying he could not bear the sounds below. I offered him bread, but he wept, saying he could not sleep. By morning he was gone. The enslaved men and women of the household fared worst. They spoke least for fear of punishment, but their eyes betrayed terror. Some carved crosses into door frames. Others whispered prayers in tongues foreign to New England ears. A few tried to flee, none succeeded. By 1772, the Rutherford staff was reduced to only those too bound by debt or too frightened to resist. Elias rarely hired replacements. It was as though he no longer needed them. Only the twins, and whatever they had become, mattered. In Providence, taverns, drink, loosened tongues muttered of screams carried on the wind at night, of strange lights leaking from the cellar windows. Yet no magistrate investigated. Wealth shielded the Rutherfords, and fear sealed the town's lips, and still the twins remained unseen. Their names vanished from records, their faces absent from memory, save for the cries that continued beneath earth and stone. It is tempting to imagine the church as innocent in this tale, but history reveals complicity. Pastor Whitcomb, though visibly shaken by what he heard in the Rutherford house, refused to intervene. His sermons grew vague, filled with warnings of darkness that the Lord alone may judge. Parish accounts showed generous Rutherford donations, funds that kept the church roofed, the parish school running, and Whitcomb himself comfortably housed. But darker evidence emerges in Whitcomb's private ledger, discovered decades later. Within, coded notations suggest that he visited the Rutherford home regularly, sometimes at midnight, always entering by the servant's door. He described vigils in the basement, during which prayers were spoken not in the name of Christ, but in guttural syllables unfit for Scripture. One note, dated 1771, reads, "They chant in unison, though no one leads them. The children's voices guide the rest. God forgive me, but I feel his absence here." Other ministers in Providence seemed equally reluctant to confront the family. Some avoided mention of the twins entirely. Others hinted at sacrifices required for the city's prosperity. Was this mere cowardice, or was Providence itself built upon bargains unspoken, wealth drawn from not only trade, but from secrets buried alive? The church's silence was its own sermon, and in that silence the Rutherfords' basement became a sanctuary of a different order, one in which children, locked in darkness, served as the high priests of something not divine but profane. By 1774, the cries ceased. For nearly a decade, neighbors had lived with the knowledge, or at least the suspicion, that children were hidden beneath the Rutherford home. Their voices had become part of the night, as familiar as wind through trees. And then, one winter's evening, they ended. No whimper, no moan, no scream, only silence. At first, relief washed over the servants. They spoke cautiously of peace restored, of sleep without nightmares. But within weeks, unease returned. The silence was not release. It was a weight pressing upon the house and the town alike. Where once there was noise, now there was absence, and that absence was worse. Elias grew thinner, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling. He no longer attended church. He no longer oversaw his ships. He wandered the house at night, muttering in half-formed prayers. In April of that year, a traveler lodged nearby claimed to see Elias standing at the cellar door, whispering, his hands pressed flat against the iron as if pleading. The traveler swore he heard whispers answer back, faint and terrible, but could not make out the words. And then, suddenly, Elias was gone. Some said he sailed for England. Others claimed he locked himself in the basement and never emerged. The truth is uncertain, for after that year the Rutherford mansion stood nearly empty, its shutters closed, its gardens overgrown, its iron door rusting but never opened. What had become of the twins? None dared to ask aloud. Providence had learned its lesson. Some silences are safer unbroken. After Elias Rutherford's disappearance in 1774, the mansion lingered like a wound on Providence's landscape. His surviving children, ashamed or perhaps terrified, sold off much of the family's shipping empire and relocated to Connecticut. Only the house remained, locked and sealed, its windows shuttered, its gardens overtaken by weeds. No one wished to live there. Tenants who tried reported strange disturbances, doors that slammed at night, footsteps in empty halls, whispers seeping through the walls. One family fled after a single winter, claiming their youngest daughter woke each night staring at the cellar door, whispering, "They're still calling me." By the time of the Revolutionary War, the house was known locally as the Silent Estate. Children dared one another to approach its gates, but few passed beyond. When soldiers were quartered there briefly in 1777, their captain recorded that several men refused to sleep indoors, choosing the cold yard instead. He noted, "They swear the walls breathe. At night they hear infants at play, but none can find the source." The house fell into disrepair, windows cracked, the roof sagged. Ivy clawed its way up the brick walls. Yet the basement door remained intact, iron, solid, untouched by rust. Even scavengers avoided it, as though something in the air repelled their curiosity. Thus the Rutherford mansion became less a dwelling than a scar, a reminder that Providence was founded not only on trade and prayer, but on silences maintained at terrible cost. During the war, Providence became a crucible of rebellion, yet the Rutherford house retained its own strange hold. Patriots and loyalists alike avoided its grounds. Stories spread among soldiers, that Elias Rutherford had not abandoned the colony but had bargained with forces older than empire itself. In taverns, veterans claimed the twins' voices could be heard on misty nights, carrying across the harbor like signals. Some swore they whispered warnings, others said they offered promises, victory, power, immortality, depending on who listened. One letter from a militiaman describes a patrol that passed the mansion late at night. He wrote, "We heard a lullaby from within, sweet but hollow, the air stank of wet stone. Our lieutenant ordered us forward, but the shutters clapped shut as we approached, and the singing ceased." I have never marched so quickly from any house. Theories multiplied. Some believed the Rutherfords had hidden Tory spies beneath their floorboards. Others whispered that Elias had offered his children as vessels to something not human, binding the fate of Providence to their survival. A darker few believed the silence after 1774 was not the end of the twins, but their transformation. No longer voices of flesh, but presences that seeped into the walls, the soil, the very air. For the people of Providence, revolution did not erase the house's shadow. If anything, it deepened it. Freedom from Britain brought no freedom from what the Rutherfords had birthed and buried. In 1791, nearly 20 years after Elias vanished, Providence authorities attempted to reclaim the Rutherford mansion. The city was growing and prime land could not remain idle. Magistrates ordered the doors opened and the property assessed for auction. 3 men entered, a clerk, a mason, and a constable. Only the clerk returned. His report, written shakily, survives in the archives. "We entered by the front. Dust and cobwebs covered all. The air was foul as of rotting cloth. The constable went to test the cellar door. When he touched it, the hinges shrieked as though alive. He forced it open. The darkness within seemed to move, and a voice, low, twin-toned, neither male nor female, spoke our names. The mason fled down the hall, and I never saw him again. The constable stepped inside, and the door slammed shut of its own accord. I pounded upon it, but no sound came from within. After an hour I fled. When I returned with others, the door was closed again, untouched, the cellar silent. The magistrates dismissed the account as hysteria, but they did not press further. The house remained sealed. The auction was cancelled. The clerk resigned within the year and was found drowned in the harbor. The mason was never located. As for the constable, his name was erased from records, as though he had never existed at all. By the early 1800s, Providence's population had swelled, and the question of the Rutherford property resurfaced. A group of reformers proposed converting the estate into an orphanage. On paper, it was a noble plan, shelter for the unwanted children of a growing industrial town. In practice, it became a tragedy whispered for generations. The orphanage opened in 1804, housing nearly 30 children. At first, reports were mundane illness, cramped conditions. But within months, rumors spread that the children spoke of friends in the basement. They played games at night that mimicked unseen voices, chanting in tones too low for their years. Nurses complained of scratches along the walls, as though tiny hands pressed from within. The matron dismissed it until she too heard lullabies in the dark, harmonized in perfect unison by voices that did not belong to any child she could name. By winter, sickness tore through the orphanage. But it was not fever alone that killed. Several children were found at dawn, lifeless, their eyes wide, mouths stained with soil, as though they had tried to swallow the earth itself. The orphanage was closed quietly in 1806. No official record explains why, but the townsfolk knew. The Rutherford house had taken children before. It would take them again. Strangely, from 1810 onward, records of the Rutherford estate diminish. Deeds vanish. Census entries omit the property. Maps show its outline faintly, then erase it altogether. It was as though the house itself resisted remembrance, yet oral history persisted. Old women warned children not to wander near the grounds. Sailors swore the house's windows glowed faintly before storms. Ministers avoided the subject entirely, and still the cellar door remained, unopened, unbroken, unyielding. In 1823, a historian named Jonathan Hale attempted to compile a genealogy of Providence families. When he reached the Rutherfords, his work faltered. In his notes, he wrote, "Every mention is obscured. Pages are missing from registers. It is as if a hand has deliberately erased them." And yet, in tavern talk and in whispered stories, the name persists, clinging like mold to the memory of this city. Weeks later, Hale himself vanished. His manuscript was found in his study, the pages waterlogged, though no rain had fallen. The chapter on the Rutherfords ended mid-sentence. The twins remain, though not as flesh. They are the cities. The ink trails off. In 1842, a group of antiquarians from Boston traveled to Providence to investigate the Rutherford estate. They were men of learning, historians, natural philosophers, skeptics of superstition. They believed the tales of the twins were nothing but provincial folklore, the residue of colonial hysteria. What happened to them has never been officially recorded, but fragments survive in their journals. One entry written by Dr. Alcott states, "The architecture below is unnatural. The angles resist compass. Voices resonate though the air is still. We found bones, small and brittle, pressed into the mortar as though the walls themselves consumed them." Another, from Professor Wilder, is shorter. "The twins are not gone. They never were children, not as we understand. Their cries were rehearsals. Their silence is the truer song. Of the 7 scholars who entered, only 2 returned. They refused to speak of what they had seen. One renounced his profession, retreating to a monastery. The other drank himself to death within a year. Their colleagues were simply gone, absorbed into the silence beneath the house." Afterward, the Rutherford estate was officially declared unfit for habitation. But the scholars' journals circulated quietly, inspiring dread among those who read them. It was no longer possible to dismiss the twins as rumor. They had become something larger, symbols of Providence's pact with secrecy, reminders that what is hidden does not vanish, it waits. In 1860, the land was purchased by a newly founded theological seminary. The administrators claimed the mansion would serve as a dormitory and chapel, a place where young men could train for lives of ministry. But beneath their piety lay another purpose. Letters among the seminary founders reveal that they sought to study the phenomenon of the Rutherford twins, believing the house itself to be a site of divine or demonic manifestation. They sealed off the upper floors but left the basement intact. Students were forbidden to enter, yet rumors spread quickly of midnight experiments led by faculty. Chants echoed from the cellar at night. Candles burned for days without extinguishing. One student in a letter home described his professor descending with a chalice, returning pale and trembling, his hands dripping with something dark. The seminary endured barely a decade. By 1871, enrollment collapsed and its records were destroyed in a mysterious fire. Survivors of the blaze whispered that they had seen children's shadows in the smoke, moving not away from the flames but into them. To this day, no official archive preserves the seminary's existence. It is remembered only in fragments, scorched letters, charred hymnals, the bones unearthed when the foundations were later surveyed. In 1897, workers digging near the Rutherford property uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the earth, lined with bricks bearing unfamiliar symbols. Inside lay a cradle, rotted but intact, its bedding stained with dark residue that had not faded despite the passing century. Witnesses reported that the air inside was thick, unbreathable, as though it resisted lungs themselves. The men fled, but one, James Parker, lingered long enough to lift a scrap of cloth from the cradle. Within days, he fell ill with fever and delirium. His final words, recorded by his wife, were, "They are awake. They are waiting for the door to open." Authorities quickly sealed the chamber again. Officially, it was dismissed as a colonial foundation vault. Unofficially, the workers never returned, and the site was abandoned once more. Yet the discovery proved something undeniable. The Rutherfords had not merely hidden their twins. They had built a structure to contain them, a womb of stone meant to hold voices that did not die with silence. By the turn of the 20th century, the Rutherford estate was nearly forgotten, its grounds swallowed by weeds, its reputation reduced to a ghost story told by schoolchildren. But in 1922, a family from New York, unaware of the legend, purchased the property. The Whitcombs moved in with 3 children. Neighbors recall their cheerfulness, their belief that the mansion could be restored. Within months, that cheer curdled. The youngest Whitcomb boy began speaking in a voice not his own, addressing his sister by a name no one had taught him, Margaret. The daughter refused to sleep in her room, insisting that two pale children stood at her window each night asking her to play. Their father, Henry Whitcomb, grew obsessed with the cellar, spending nights hammering at the iron door, claiming he could hear his children's voices within. By spring of 1923, the family was gone. The neighbors heard no departure, no wagons or farewells, only a final night of screams echoing across the yard until abruptly silenced. When authorities investigated weeks later, the house was empty. Plates remained on the table, beds unmade, but the Whitcombs had vanished without trace. The cellar door stood ajar for the first time in living memory. Beyond it lay only darkness, bottomless, waiting. Today, the Rutherford estate no longer stands. It was demolished in 1938 after the hurricane tore through Providence, its ruins buried under new streets and modern buildings. On the surface, nothing remains. And yet, locals still speak of the silence. Pedestrians crossing the block where the house once stood say their footsteps sound muffled as though swallowed. Children cry there more often, inconsolable, their parents unable to soothe them. Work crews report tools going missing, only to be found days later buried in the soil, damp and cold to the touch. No plaque marks the Rutherfords' name. No archive fully preserves their story, but silence is its own memorial. It clings to Providence like a shadow, a reminder that what the Rutherfords tried to bury was never theirs to control. The twins never saw the light again, and perhaps that was Providence's salvation. Or perhaps it was only the beginning of a hunger that does not end, a silence that spreads, waiting for the day when the door, wherever it has gone, opens once more.